Hey, and welcome back to the Devlog series for my 2D survival horror game, Never Forgotten, which you can wishlist now on Steam. So, last week I went ahead and made a new enemy for the game. Since then I've worked on finishing the functionality for the rest of the default enemies for Act 2, as well as a little bit of music and beginning to polish up Chapter 1 of Act 2. The plan for the following weeks is to implement basic visuals for each of the new levels, followed by music and ambience. So now to get right into it, I'll go ahead and show off what I've been doing for Act 2, Chapter 1. Upon seeing this, I imagine the first thing that sticks out are these dark gradients. I do make use of Unity's 2D lighting system, but I only use the global lighting option, which essentially just adjusts the brightness for the level. However, I found that later on into development that a simple gradient like this helps with creating a thicker atmosphere, emphasizing the idea that you're surrounded by darkness. Being surrounded by darkness, of course, refers to the idea of just everything blanketed in a constant darkness. This sort of technique can also be used to highlight where the player should go. For example, in several instances, I make the bottom of the screen darker to highlight the top path where I want the player to go. This also has a narrative meaning, creating this idea that some sort of darkness is chasing the learned soul, a darkness which can appear from nowhere. Back to the level now. If you remember what this level looked like from my last video, you might recognize that I polished up some of the assets, most notably the trees. Given I wanted this level to be a thick forest, I wanted to give the impression that the trees are so tall that you can't even see their tops. Of course, for visibility reasons and technical limitations, I need to cut the trees off. If I didn't, the screen would be really messy. The technical limitation I mentioned is simply that this is a 2D game drawn from a top-down perspective, making it a tad more difficult to design areas with trees this tall or any other objects this tall that would overlap with other things. Because of course, if this was a 3D environment, you could just put the trees there, and they don't necessarily overlap with anything because you got your 3 dimensions. I don't know how to talk about this in a more intelligent sense. It's just it's easier when it's done in 3D than when it's done in 2D. Because in 2D you gotta account for sprite ordering and all that stuff. But because of their height, I run into the issue of sprite ordering, which I just mentioned, where in some instances, some parts of the tree need to be rendered above the player, but other parts need to be rendered maybe below another tree that is beneath them, creating some tricky situations. To fix this, I sometimes split the trees into 2 halves so that if I need to, I can specify that the lower half must be on a lower render order. To communicate the height of the trees before, I simply just used a gradient, which looked okay, but not great. The biggest issue here is that it would be incredibly difficult to get the exact width of the tree down and have it match the sprite properly. There's a chance that I'm always going to be just a tinsy tad off. And because of that, I opted to just draw the gradient into the sprites themselves. After some trial and error, I got it to a point where I'm happy with it, and the nice thing is that it doesn't just fade to black, but continues to fade out so that it, gives a smooth effect instead of just abruptly ending. Walking through the level, you can see that I also make use of light gradients, which are used for atmospheric purposes as well as leading the player and, of course, narrative purposes. Given I can't use color, and color is a really nice way of guiding the player in a subtle fashion, I do have to make use of basically just lighting. Places that are lighter are typically the places you need to go, places that are darker are typically the places that you don't need to go, but sometimes I can't stay consistent to that rule for narrative reasons. To get back on track though, I also improved upon the shrub sprites that were in place before, which looked quite awful. They were, of course, not final, but yeah, they look really bad. I'm not very good at drawing flora and pixel art, so it helps that the trees in Never Forgotten are dead and don't have any leaves on them, so I can just draw simpler shapes, because branches are just lines and sharp lines. Honestly, what does most of the work here is the lighting. Again, it's incredibly simple, but given how everything in the game is just black and white, having a slight gradient over everything helps give the game's visuals a richer feel. A richer feel in that they just have a wider turn than just white or black. I don't think the use of gradients like this fits with the 1-bit style, since the gradients are made up of grays and such, all the in-betweens are black and white. That being said, I'm not really going for a, true retro look as much as I'm just limited with what I can do artistically, and so I settled on a 1-bit pixel art style. Funnily enough, the 1-bit nature of the visuals was just an offhand decision that ended up working quite well for the narrative and turn of the game. The main reason I originally chose a 1-bit style was simply because I'm awful with color palettes and shading. So with that done, the level looks much closer to completion now. I still have a ways to go before I can call it finished, but just taking it one step at a time for now is all I need to do. So that's all for this week's devlog. I hope you enjoyed, and of course, thanks for watching all the way to the end. I'm thinking for next week I'll work on some music and ambience for Act 2 Chapter 1, so that should be interesting, getting to show off more of the sound design aspect of the game and all. Also, if you liked what you saw from the game, consider wishlisting it on Steam. That'd be much appreciated, thanks. Well, anyways, I'll see y'all next week. Until then.